It's no surprise to anyone that the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses is run by a group of men headquartered in a complex of buildings in Warwick, New York. A kind of Vatican, but without the artwork. This group of men is known as the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, and according to them, their doctrinal and administrative decisions are guided by none other than God's own Holy Spirit. And of course, why not? They use Bible texts to claim that this arrangement has a biblical basis. In this video, we're going to focus on clarifying the meaning of one of the passages these leaders use to claim that they exercise authority granted by Jehovah of armies himself, Lord of heaven and earth, of everything visible and invisible. I'm referring to the parable of the faithful and discreet slave. Stay until the end, because in this video we're going to dismantle one of the main arguments used by Jehovah's Witnesses. Let's begin. The first thing that needs to be said is this: the term governing body does not appear in the Bible. And yes, that's already a problem. Because on other topics, like the Trinity, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses tend to be very strict about the term not appearing in the Bible. But when it comes to their governing body, suddenly they become flexible and say, well, the term isn't in the Bible, but the idea is. Anyway, just another case of inconsistency. But is it actually true that the idea or concept of a governing body appears in the Bible? According to their leaders, one of the passages where the governing body is supposedly mentioned is Matthew chapter 24, verses 42 through 51, the parable of the faithful and discreet slave. As you can verify by reading Matthew chapter 24, verses 42 through 51, the topic Jesus is addressing is that Christians must stay alert because they do not know on what day their Lord is coming. In fact, verse 42 specifically says, "Keep on the watch, therefore, because you do not know on what day your Lord is coming." It is within that context that Jesus speaks the words recorded in Matthew chapter 24, verses 45 through 47, which say, "Who really is the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed over his domestics, to give them their food at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. Truly I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings." So the message of Jesus' parable is very simple, nothing complicated. Stay awake, like faithful and discreet slaves, because you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. If you do, you will receive your due reward. In fact, if you look closely, this passage, rather than supporting the doctrine of Jehovah's Witnesses, actually works against it. Because as verse 42 says, no one knows on what day the Lord is coming. That attitude is the exact opposite of what the leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses have done. They have spent their time trying to find hidden messages in the scriptures to determine when the Lord would come. That's how they pointed to dates like 1914, 1925, and 1975. They also said that the generation of 1914 would not pass away, and today they say that the overlapping generation of 1914 will not pass away. It's remarkable that they don't realize these verses actually work against them. However, some witnesses get confused by the words at the end of verse 47, where it says that Jesus would appoint the faithful slave over all his belongings. The confusion comes from the fact that their leaders have taught them that these words imply that Jesus grants special authority to that faithful and discreet slave, which, according to them, is the governing body. So let's clarify what this really means. By the way, if you're enjoying this podcast, leave me a like, share it with someone who might benefit from it, and subscribe if you haven't already. You can also join the channel membership. That way, you'll get access to exclusive content where I can speak more openly about sensitive topics. Just click the link in the description. Thanks to those who have already joined. Your support makes this content possible. Let's continue. So when Jesus said that he would appoint the faithful and discreet slave over all his belongings, does that mean he was giving authority to the governing body over his entire church or congregation? In this regard, the first thing that needs to be said is that the leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses themselves have interpreted these verses in different ways throughout their history. In the early days, Charles Taze Russell taught that the faithful and discreet slave was the Watchtower Society, while his followers claimed that the faithful and discreet slave was Russell himself. Although, to be fair, back then the Watchtower Society and Charles Taze Russell were essentially the same thing. When I was a witness, in the 1980s and 1990s, they said that the faithful and discreet slave was the anointed remnant. This expression refers to those who, according to witnesses, belong to the select group of the 144,000 who will go to heaven but are still alive on earth. A remnant that, by the way, was supposed to decrease in number, yet today we see the opposite. It has increased. Just one more inconsistency added to the long list within the organization's doctrines. It was in the July 2013 study edition of the Watchtower that they introduced the new doctrine. The faithful and discreet slave was no longer the anointed remnant, but the governing body. So, my Jehovah's Witness friend, consider this. Their interpretation of who the faithful and discreet slave is has changed dramatically over time, and you don't know whether it will change again in the future. So why wear yourself out defending an interpretation that could change in just a few months or years? Now then, what did Jesus actually mean when he said he would appoint him over all his belongings? Does it mean he was granting special authority over his congregation? The reality is that even here, there's no need to resort to the kind of strained interpretations used by Jehovah's Witnesses. If you're familiar with the scriptures, you know that the hope of the first Christians was to inherit the kingdom of God along with Christ. In fact, on the night he was to be handed over, Jesus spoke the words recorded in Luke chapter 22, verses 28 through 30. However, you are the ones who have stuck with me in my trials, and I make a covenant with you, just as my Father has made a covenant with me, for a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. As we can see, Jesus is speaking about a future heavenly reward, not about a position of earthly authority over his followers. It is a promise for all his followers, not just for a small group. This is clearly stated in Romans chapter 8, verse 17. If, then, we are children, we are also heirs, heirs indeed of God, but joint heirs with Christ, provided we suffer together, so that we may also be glorified together. And in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, it is written, if we go on enduring, we will also rule together as kings. Another aspect of the parable that the leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses emphasize is the fact that Jesus said the faithful and discreet slave was put in charge of the household to give food at the proper time. In this way, they connect the governing body with the faithful and discreet slave of Jesus' parable, and they connect the food that the slave would dispense with the magazines, books, brochures, and now videos that the governing body provides, all of which, according to them, is spiritual food served at the proper time. To properly understand this verse, it must be clear that the first Christians identified the food that comes from God as His Word, not as magazines, books, brochures, or videos produced by some leader. And it is also important to understand that all Christians were ministers of that Word, not just a small group of leaders. That is why it is written in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20. Therefore, we are ambassadors substituting for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. As substitutes for Christ, we beg, become reconciled to God. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, it says, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for special possession, that you should declare abroad the excellencies of the one who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. In the parable of the faithful and discreet slave, Jesus encourages his followers to remain vigilant, continuing as ministers of the word, because they do not know when their Lord is coming. And he tells them that if they do so, he will appoint them over all his belongings. That is, he will grant them a position of authority in heaven. Nowhere does it say, as the governing body actually teaches, that Jesus arrived in 1919, inspected the religions of the world, and found the leadership of the Watchtower feeding his people, and therefore granted them authority as the governing body. This is a clear example of exegesis versus eisegesis. Exegesis means seeking what the writers of the biblical text originally intended to say, while eisegesis means imposing a meaning onto the text that it never originally had. We can say, without fear of being mistaken, that the writers of Watchtower publications are excellent practitioners of eisegesis, which, as you can see, is not exactly a compliment. In a future video, I will analyze another passage that the leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses distort in order to demand obedience from their followers. I'm referring to Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 28. But in the meantime, I'll leave you here a playlist about the price of being a Jehovah's Witness, and down below, you'll find a video specially selected for you. See you next time.